Hello everyone! I hope you're ready for another adventure, because today Wayne continues to read Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Always remember that as we read through this story and explore these amazing adventures, all you have to do is press the CC button in your YouTube link to be able to follow along with the words. Since this is Harry Potter, Madame Owl will be perfect to jump into this adventure. Now that she's here, let's jump in. Chapter 12, The Mirror of Erised. Christmas was coming. One morning in mid-December woke to find itself covered in several feet of snow. The lake frozen solid, and the Weasley twins were punished for bewitching several snowballs so that they followed Quirrell around, bouncing off the back of his turban. The few owls that managed to battle their way through the stormy sky to deliver mail had to be nursed back to health by Hagrid before they could fly off again. No one could wait for the start of the holidays. While the Gryffindor common room and the Great Hall had roaring fires and drafty corridors had become icy and bitter, wind rattled the windows into the classrooms. Worst of all were Professor Snape's classes in the dungeons, where the breath rose as a mist before them, and they kept as close as possible to their hot cauldrons. "I do feel so sorry," said Draco Malfoy one potions class, "for all those who have to stay at Hogwarts for Christmas because they're not wanted at home." He was looking over at Harry as he spoke. Crabbe and Goyle chuckled. Harry, who was measuring out powdered spine of lionfish, ignored him. Malfoy had been even more unpleasant than usual since the Quidditch match. Disgusted that the Slytherins had lost, he had tried to get everyone laughing at how wide-mouthed Treefrog would be replacing Harry as Seeker next. Then he'd realized that no one found this funny, because they were all so impressed by the way Harry had managed to stay on his bucking broomstick. So Malfoy, jealous and angry, had begun to taunting Harry about having no proper family. It was true Harry wasn't going back to Privet Drive for Christmas. Professor McGonagall had come around the week before making a list of students who would be staying for the holidays, and Harry signed up at once. He didn't feel so sorry for himself at all. This would probably be the best Christmas he'd ever had. Ron and his brothers were staying too, because Mr. and Mrs. Weasley were going to Romania to visit Charlie. When they left the dungeons, at the end of the potions, they found a large fir tree blocking the corridor ahead. Two enormous feet sticking out from the bottom, and a proud puffing sound told them that Hagrid was behind it. "Hi, Hagrid. Want any help?" Ron asked, sticking his head through the branches. "Nah, I'm alright. Thanks, Ron." "Would you mind moving out of the way?" came Malfoy's cold drawl behind him. "Are you trying to turn some extra money, Weasley? Hoping to gamekeeper yourself when you leave Hogwarts, I suppose. That hut of Hagrid's must seem like a palace compared to your family's used to." Ron dived at Malfoy just as Snape came up the stairs. "Weasley!" Ron let go of Malfoy's robes. "He was provoked," Professor Snape said Hagrid, sticking his hairy face out from behind a birch tree. "Malfoy was insulting his family." "Be that as it may, fighting is against Hogwarts, Hagrid," said Snape silkily. 5 points from Gryffindor, Weasley, and be grateful it isn't more. Move along, all of you." Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle pushed roughly past the tree, scattering needles everywhere and smirking. "I'll get him," said Ron, grinding his teeth at Malfoy's back. "One of these days, I'll get him." "I hate them both," said Harry, "Malfoy and Snape." "Come on, cheer up. It's nearly Christmas," said Hagrid. "Tell you what, come with me to the Great Hall and see it. Looks a treat." So the two of them followed Hagrid and his tree to the Great Hall, where Professor McGonagall and Professor Flitwick were busy with Christmas decorations. "Ah, Hagrid, the last tree. Put it in the far corner, would you? The hall looked spectacular. Festoons of holly and mistletoe hung around the walls, and no less than 12 towering Christmas trees stood around the room, some sparkly with tiny icicles, some glittery with hundreds of candles. How many days you got left until your holidays?" asked Hagrid. "Just one," said Hermione. "And that reminds me, Harry, Ron, we've got an hour before lunch. We should be lit in the library." "Oh yeah, you're right," said Ron, tearing his eyes away from Professor Flitwick, who had golden bubbles blossoming out of his hand and was trailing them over the branches of the new tree. "The library?" said Hagrid, following them out of the hall. "Just before the holidays? Bit keen, are you?" "Oh, we're not working," said Harry brightly. "Ever since you mentioned Nicholas Flamel, we've been trying to find out who he is." "You what?" Hagrid looked shocked. "Listen here, I've been Drop it. It's nothing to you what the dog is guarding. We just want to know who Nicholas Flamel is, that's all," said Hermione. "Unless you'd like to tell us and save us the trouble," Harry asked. We must have been through hundreds of books already, and we can't find him anywhere. Just give us a hint. I know I've read his name somewhere." "I'm saying nothing," said Hagrid flatly. "Just have to find out ourselves then," said Ron, and they left Hagrid looking disgruntled and hurried off to the library. They had indeed been looking for Nicholas Flamel's name ever since Hagrid let it slip, because how else were they going to find out what Snape was trying to steal? The trouble was, it was very hard to know where to begin, not knowing what Flamel might have done to get himself in a book. He wasn't in great wizards of the 20th century, or the notable magical names of our time. He was missing, too, from important modern magical discoveries and a study of developments in wizardry. And then, of course, there was the sheer size of the library. Tens of thousands of books, thousands of shelves, hundreds of narrow rows. Hermione took out a list of subjects and titles she had decided to search for while Ron strode around rows and rows and started pulling them out of the shelves at random. Harry wandered over to the restricted section. He had been wondering for a while if Flamel wasn't somewhere in there. Unfortunately, you needed a specially signed note from one of the teachers to look at any of the restricted books. He knew he'd never get one. These were the books containing dark magic never taught at Hogwarts, and only read by older students studying advanced defense against the dark arts. "What are you looking for, boy?" "Nothing," said Harry. Madame Pince, the librarian, brandished a feather duster at him. "You'd better get out then. Go on, out." Wishing he'd been a bit quicker at thinking up some story, Harry left the library. He and Ron and Hermione had already agreed they'd better not ask Madame Pince whether they could find Flamel. They were sure she'd be able to tell them, but they couldn't risk Snape hearing what they were up to. Harry waited outside the corridor to see if the other two had found anything, but he wasn't very hopeful. They had been looking for over 2 weeks, after all. But as they had only odd moments between lessons, it wasn't surprising they found nothing. What they really needed was a nice long search without Madame Pince breathing down their necks. 5 minutes later, Ron and Hermione joined him, shaking their heads. They went off to lunch. "You'll keep searching while I'm away, won't you?" said Hermione, "and send me an owl if you find anything." "And you could ask your parents if they know who Flamel is," Ron said. "It'd be safe to ask them." "Very safe. They're both dentists," said Hermione. Once the holidays had started, Ron and Harry were having too good a time to think about Flamel. They had the dormitory themselves, and the common room was far emptier than usual, so they were able to get good armchairs by the fire. They sat by the hour, eating anything they could spear on toasting forks, bread, English muffins, marshmallows, and plotting ways to get Malfoy expelled, which were fun to talk about even if they wouldn't work. Ron also started teaching Harry wizard chess. This was exactly like Muggle chess, except that the figures were alive, which made it a lot like directing troops in battle. Ron's set was very old and battered, like everything else he owned. It had once belonged to someone in his family, in this case his grandfather. However, old chessmen weren't a drawback at all. Ron knew them so well he never had trouble getting them to do what he wanted. Harry played with chessman Seamus Finnegan had lent him, and they didn't trust him at all. He wasn't a very good player yet, and they kept shouting bits of advice at him, which were confusing. "Don't send me there. Can't you see his knight? Send him. We can afford to lose him." On Christmas Eve, Harry went to bed, looking forward to the next day for the food and the fun, but not expecting any presents at all. When he woke early the next morning, however, the first thing he saw was a small pile of packages at the foot of his bed. "Merry Christmas," said Ron sleepily as Harry scrambled out of bed and pulled on his bathrobe. "You too," said Harry. "Will you look at this? I've got presents." "What did you expect, turnips?" said Ron, turning his own pile, which is a lot bigger than Harry's. Harry picked up the top parcel. It was wrapped in thick brown paper and scrawled across it to Harry from Hagrid. Inside, a roughly cut wooden flute. Harry had obviously whittled it himself. Harry blew it. It sounded a bit like an owl. A second, very small parcel contained a note. "We received your message and enclosed your Christmas present from Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia." Taped to the note was 50 pence. "That's friendly," said Harry. Ron was fascinated by 50 pence. "Weird," he said. "What a shape. Is this money?" "You can keep it," said Harry, laughing at how pleased Ron was. "Hagrid and my aunt and uncle. Who sent these?" "I think I know who that one's from," said Ron, turning a bit pink and pointing to the lumpy parcel. "My mom. I told her you wouldn't expect any presents, and, oh no," he groaned. She's made you a Weasley sweater! Had torn open the parcel to find a thick hand-knitted sweater with emerald green and large box of homemade fudge. Every year she sends us a sweater, said Ron, unwrapping his. And mine's always maroon. That's really nice of her, said Harry, trying the fudge, which was very tasty. His next present only contained candy, a large box of chocolate frogs from Hermione. The last one, this only left one parcel. Harry picked up and felt it. It was very light. He unwrapped it. Something fluid and silvery gray went slithering onto the floor, where its gleaming folds, Ron gasped. I've heard of those, he said in a hushed voice, dropping the box of every flavor beans he'd gotten from Hermione. If it's what I think it is, they're really rare and very valuable. What is it? Harry picked up the shiny silvery cloth off the floor. It's strange to the touch, like water woven into material. It's an invisibility cloak, said Ron, a look of awe on his face. I'm sure it is. Try it on. Harry threw the cloak over his shoulder and Ron gave a yell. It is! Look down! Harry looked down at his feet, but they were gone. He dashed to the mirror. Sure enough, his reflection looked back at him, just his head suspended in mid-air, his body completely invisible. He pulled up the cloak over his head, and his reflection vanished completely. Here's a note, said Ron suddenly. A note fell out of it. Harry pulled the coat and seized the letter. Written in narrow, loopy writing he had never seen before were the following words. Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well. A very Merry Christmas to you. There was no signature. Harry stared at the note. Ron was admiring the cloak. I'd give anything for one of these, he said. Anything. What's the matter? Nothing, said Harry. He felt very strange. Who had sent the cloak? Had it really belonged to his father? Before he could say or think anything else, the dormitory door flung over, and Fred and George Weasley bounded in. Harry stuffed the cloak quietly out of sight. He didn't feel like sharing it with anyone else yet. Merry Christmas! Hey look, Harry's got a Weasley sweater too. Fred and George were wearing blue sweaters, one with a large yellow F on it and the other with a G. Harry's is better than ours, though, said Fred, holding up Harry's sweater. She obviously makes more of an effort if you're not family. Why aren't you wearing yours, Ron? George demanded. Come on, get it. They're lovely, warm. I hate maroon, Ron moaned half-heartedly, but he pulled it over his head. You haven't gotten a letter on yours, George observed. I hope she thinks you don't forget your name. But we're not stupid. We know ours are Gred and Forge. What's all this noise? Percy Weasley stuck his head through the door, looking disapprovingly. He had clearly gotten halfway through unwrapping his presents too. He carried a large lumpy sweater over his arm, which Fred seized. P for prefect. Get it on, Percy. Come on. We're all wearing ours. Even Harry's got one. I don't want, said Percy thickly, as the twins forced the sweater over his head, knocking his glasses askew. And they're not sitting those prefects today either, said George. Christmas is a time for family. They frog-marched Percy from the room, his arms pinned to his side by his sweater. Harry had never in all of his life had such a Christmas dinner. 100 fat roasted turkeys, hundreds of roasted and boiled potatoes, platters of chipotles, terrines and buttered peas, silver boats of rich gray and cranberry sauce, the stacks of wizard crackers every few feet along the table. These fantastic party favors were nothing like the feeble muggles ones the Dursleys usually bought, with their plastic little toys and their flimsy paper hats inside. Harry pulled a wizard cracker with Fred, and it didn't just bang. It went off like a blast of a cannon and engulfed them in a cloud of blue smoke. While the inside exploded, a Rear Admiral's hat and several live white mice. Up the table, Dumbledore had swapped a pointed wizard hat for a flowered bonnet and was chuckling merrily at a joke Professor Flitwick had just read him. Flaming Christmas puddings followed the turkey. Percy nearly broke his teeth on a silver sickle embedded in his slice. Harry watched Hagrid getting redder and redder in his face as he called for more wine, finally kissing Professor McGonagall on the cheek, who, to Harry's amazement, giggled and blushed, her top hat lopsided. When Harry finally left the table, he was laden with a stack of things out of the crackers, including a pack of non-explodable luminous balloons, a grow-your-own-warts kit, and his own new wizard chest. The white mice had disappeared, and Harry had a nasty feeling they were going to end up in Mrs. Norris's Christmas dinner. Harry and the Weasleys had spent a happy afternoon having the furious snowball fight on the grounds. Then, cold, wet, and gasping for breath, they returned to the fire of the Gryffindor common room, where Harry broke in his new chest by losing spectacularly to Ron. He suspected he wouldn't have lost badly if Percy hadn't have tried to help him so much. After a meal of turkey sandwiches, crumpets, trife, and Christmas cake, everyone felt too full and sleepy to do much before bed, except sit and watch Percy chase Fred and George all over a Gryffindor tower because they'd stolen his prefect badge. It had been Harry's best Christmas day ever. Yet, something had been nagging at the back of his mind all day. Not until he climbed into bed was he free to think about it. The invisibility cloak and whoever had sent it. Ron, full of turkey and cake and with nothing mysterious to bother him, fell asleep almost as soon as he drew the curtains of his four-poster. Harry leaned over to the side of his own bed and pulled the cloak from under it. His father's. This had been his father's. He let the material flow in his hands. Smoother than silk, light as air. Use it well, the note said. He had to try it now. He slipped out of bed and wrapped the cloak around himself. Looking down at his legs, he saw only moonlight and shadows. It was a very funny feeling. Use it well. Suddenly, Harry felt wide awake. The whole of Hogwarts was open to him in his cloak. Excitement flooded through him as he stood there in the darkness and silence. He could go anywhere in this. Anywhere, and Filch would never know. Ron grunted in his sleep. Should Harry wake him? Something held him back. His father's cloak, he felt that this time, the first time, he wanted to use it alone. He crept out of the dormitory, down the stairs, across the common room, and climbed through the portrait hole. "Who's there?" squawked the fat lady. Harry said nothing, and walked quietly down the corridor. Where should he go? He stopped, his heart racing in thought. And then it came to him, the restricted section in the library. He'd be able to read as long as he liked, as long as it took to find out who Flamel was. He started off, drawing the invisibility cloak tight around him as he walked. The library was pitch black and eerie. Harry lit a lamp to see his way along the row of books. The lamp looked like it was floating in midair, and even though Harry could feel his arm supporting it, the sight gave him the creeps. The restricted section was right at the back of the library. Stamping carefully over the rope that separated these books from the rest of the library, he held out his lamp to read the titles. They didn't tell him much. Their peeling, faded gold letters spelled words in languages Harry couldn't understand. Some had no title at all. One book had a dark stain on it that looked horribly like blood. The hairs on the back of Harry's neck prickled. Maybe he was imagining it, maybe not, but he thought a faint whispering was coming from the books, as though they knew someone was there who shouldn't be. He had to start somewhere. Sitting the lamp down carefully on the floor, he looked along the bottom shelf for an interesting-looking book. A large black and silver volume caught his eye. He pulled it out with difficulty because it was very heavy, and balancing on his knee, let it fall open. A piercing, blood-curdling shriek split the silence. The book was screaming. Harry snapped it shut, but the shriek went on and on, one high, unbroken, ear-splitting note. He stumbled backwards and knocked over his lamp, which went out at once. Panicking, he heard footsteps coming down the corridor outside. Stuffing the shriek book inside the shelf, he ran for it. He passed Filch in the doorway. Pale eyes looked straight through him, and Harry slipped under Filch's outstretched arms and streaked up the corridor, the book's shriek still ringing in his ears. He came to a sudden halt in front of a tall suit of armor. He had been so busy getting away from the library, he hadn't paid attention to where he was going. Perhaps because it was dark. He didn't recognize where he was. There was a suit of armor near the kitchens. He knew he must be 5 floors above there. "You asked me to come directly to you, sir, Professor, if anyone was wandering around at night, and someone's been in the library, restricted section." Harry felt the blood drain out of his face. Wherever he was, Filch must know a shortcut, because his soft, greasy voice was getting nearer and nearer. To his horror, it was Snape who replied, "The restricted section. Well, they can't be far. We'll catch them." Harry stood rooted in the spot as Filch and Snape came around the corner. They couldn't see him, of course, but it was a narrow corridor, and if they came much nearer, they'd knock into him. The cloak didn't stop him from being solid. He backed away as quietly as he could. A door stood ajar to his left. It was his only hope. He squeezed through it, holding his breath, trying not to move it, and to his relief, he managed to get in the room without their noticing it. They walked straight past, and Harry leaned against the wall, breathing deeply, listening to their footsteps dying away. That had been close. Very close. It was a few seconds before he noticed anything about the room he was in. It looked like an unused classroom. The dark shapes of desks and chairs were piled up against the walls. There was an upturned wastebasket, but prodded against the wall facing them was something that didn't look like it belonged there. Something that looked as if it had been something put there. to keep it out of the way. It was a magnificent mirror, as high as the ceiling, with an ornate gold frame, standing on 2 clawed feet. There was an inscription carved on the top. Erised strad eu ot ube kafu eu on wusi. His panic fading now that there was no sound of Filch and Snape, Harry moved nearer to the mirror, wanting to look at himself to see no reflection again. He stepped in front of it. He had to clap his hands to his mouth to keep himself from screaming. He whirled around. His heart was pounding no more furiously than the book had screamed, for he had not seen only himself in the mirror, but a whole crowd of people standing right behind him. But the room was empty. Breathing very fast, he turned slowly back to the mirror. There he was, reflected in it, white and scared looking, and there, reflected behind him, were at least 10 others. Harry looked over his shoulder, but still there was no one. Or were they all invisible too? Was he, in fact, in a room of invisible people, and the mirror's trick was to let them reflect invisible or not? He looked in the mirror again. A woman standing right behind him in his reflection was smiling and waving at him. He reached out a hand and felt the air behind him. If she was really there, he'd touch her. Their reflections were so close together, but he only felt air as she and the others existed in the mirror. She was a very pretty woman. She had dark red hair, and her eyes were like mine, Harry thought, edging a little closer to the glass, bright green, exactly the same shape. But then he noticed that she was crying, smiling but crying at the same time. The tall, thin, black-haired man standing next to her put his arm around her. He wore glasses, and his hair was untidy. It stuck up in the back, just as Harry's did. He was so close to the mirror now that his nose was nearly touching that of his reflection. "Mom," he whispered. "Dad?" They looked at him, smiling, and slowly Harry looked into their faces of the people in the mirror and saw other pairs of green eyes like his, other noses like his, even a little old man who looked as though he had Harry's knobbly knees. Harry was looking at his family for the first time in his life. The Potters smiled and waved at Harry, and he stared hungrily back at them, his hands pressed flat against the glass as though he was hoping to fall right through it and reach them. He had a powerful kind of ache inside him, half joy, half terrible sadness. How long he stood there, he didn't know. The reflections did not fade, and he looked and looked until a distant noise brought him back to his senses. He couldn't stay here. He had to find his way back to bed. He tore his eyes away from his mother's face, whispered, "I'll come back," and he hurried to his room. "You could have woken me up," Ron said crossly. "You can come tonight. I'm going back. I want to show you the mirror." "I'd like to see your mom and dad," Ron said eagerly. "And I want to see your family. All the Weasleys. You'll be able to show me your brothers and everyone." "You can see them any old time," said Ron. "Just come around my house this summer. Anyway, maybe it shows dead people. Shame about not finding Flamel, though. Have some bacon or something. Why aren't you eating anything?" Harry couldn't eat. He'd seen his parents and would be seeing them again tonight. He had almost forgotten about Flamel. It didn't seem very important anymore. Who cared what the three-headed dog was guarding? What did it matter if Snape stole it, really? "Are you all right?" said Ron. "You look odd." What Harry feared most was that he might not be able to find the mirror again. With Ron covered in the cloak too, they had to walk much more slowly the next night. They tried retracing Harry's steps from the library, wandering past the dark passageways for nearly an hour. "I'm freezing," said Ron. "Let's forget it and go back." "No," hissed Harry. "I know it's here somewhere." They passed the tall ghost of a tall witch sliding in the opposite direction, but saw no one else. Just as Ron started moaning that his feet were dead with cold, Harry spotted the suit of armor. "It's here! It's here! Yes!" They pushed the door open. Harry dropped the cloak around his shoulders and ran to the mirror. There they were, his mother and father being right at the side of him. "See?" said Harry, whispering. "I can't see anything." Look at them all. There's loads of them." "I only see you." "Look at it properly. Go on, stand where I am." Harry stepped aside, but with Ron in front of the mirror, he couldn't see any of his family anymore, just Ron in his paisley pajamas. Ron, though, was staring transfixed at his image. "Look at me," he said. "Can you see all your family standing around you?" "No, I'm alone, but I'm different. I look older and I'm head boy." "What?" I'm wearing the badge like Bill used to, and I'm holding the house cup and the Quidditch cup. I'm Quidditch captain, too." Ron tore his eyes away from the splendid sight to look excitedly at Harry. "Do you think this mirror shows the future?" "How can it? All my family are dead." "Let me have another look." You've had it to yourself all last night. Give me a bit more time. You're only holding the Quidditch cup. What's interesting about that? I want to see my parents. Don't push me. A sudden noise outside the corridor put an end to their distraction. They hadn't realized how loudly they'd been talking. Quick! Ron threw the cloak over them as the luminous eyes of Miss Norris came around the door. Ron and Harry stood still, both thinking the same thing. Did the cloak work on cats? After what seemed like an age, she turned and left. This isn't safe. She might have gone for Filch. I bet she heard us. Come on. Ron pulled Harry out of the room. The snow still hadn't melted the next morning. Want to play chess, Harry? Said Ron. No. Why don't we go and visit Hagrid? No. You go. I know what you're thinking about, Harry. That mirror. Don't go back tonight. Why not? I don't know. I've just got a bad feeling about it. And anyway, you've had too many close shaves already. Filch, Snape, and Mrs. Norris are walking around. So what if they can see you? What if they walk into you? What if you knock something over? You sound like Hermione. I'm serious, Harry. Don't go. But Harry had only one thought in his head, which was to get back in front of the mirror, and Ron wasn't going to stop him. That third night, he found his way quicker than before. He was walking so fast that he was making more noise than was wise. He didn't meet anyone, though. And there were his mother and father smiling at him, and one of his grandfathers nodding happily. Harry sank down to sit on the floor in front of the mirror. There was nothing to stop him from staying here all night with his family. Nothing at all. Except... So, back again, Harry. Harry felt as though his inside turned to ice. He looked behind him. Sitting on one of the desks by the wall was none other than Albus Dumbledore. Harry must have walked straight past him, so desperate to get to the mirror, he hadn't noticed it. I didn't see you, sir. Strange how nearsighted being visible can make you, said Dumbledore, and Harry was relieved to see that he was smiling. So, Dumbledore, slipping off the desk and sitting on the floor with Harry, you, like the hundreds before you, have discovered the delights of the mirror Erised. I didn't know what it's called, sir, but I expect you realize what it does. It shows me my family, and it showed your friend Ron himself as head boy. How did you know? I don't need a cloak to become invisible, said Dumbledore. Now, can you think about what Mirror Erised shows us all? Harry shook his head. Let me explain. The happiest man on earth would be able to use the Mirror Erised like a normal mirror. That is, he would look into it and see himself exactly how it is. Does that help? Harry thought, and then he said slowly, it shows us whatever we want. Yes and no, said Dumbledore quietly. It shows us nothing more or less than the deepest, most desperate desires of our hearts. You have never known your family, see them standing around you. Ronald Weasley, who has always been overshadowed by his brothers, sees himself standing alone, the best of all of them. However, the mirror will only give us neither knowledge or truth. Men have wasted away before it, entranced by what they have seen, or been driven mad not knowing if it shows what is real or even possible. The mirror will be moved to a new home tomorrow, Harry. And I ask you do not go looking for it again. If you do run across it, you will now be prepared. It does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live. Remember that. Now, why don't you put that admirable cloak on and get back to bed? Harry stood up. Sir? Professor Dumbledore? Can I ask you something? Obviously, you've just done so. I love Dumbledore so much. Dumbledore smiled. You may ask me one more thing, though. What do you see when you look in the mirror? I see myself holding a pair of thick woolen socks. Harry stared. One can never have enough socks, said Dumbledore. Another Christmas is coming on, and I didn't get a single pair. People insist on giving me books. It was only when he got back to bed that it struck Harry that Dumbledore might not have been quite truthful. But then, he thought, as he shoved the Scabbers off of his pillow, it had been quite a personal question. I think that is an amazing place to end today's adventure. What did you think, Madame Owl? I like that part too. We'll see you on the next adventure, okay? And we'll see you on the next adventure, here with Wayne Reads. Thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to see you again. Bye-bye!